Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of Second Nature Living with Ecological Grief. I'm your host, Ashlee Cunsolo, and I am so excited to be starting this journey with you. Speaking about ecological grief, living with ecological grief, and learning about it and sharing the stories is something that I'm deeply passionate about, and something that I'm really excited to share this journey with you and these amazing guests that you're going to hear, and also just to share the space and have the conversations about what it means to live with grief and sadness for the environment and for the climate crisis in these times. So, this podcast and show has been something that I have wanted to do for many, many, many years. I've been working academically and professionally in the field of ecological grief and climate change and mental health for over 15 years. And over that time, I've had the biggest honor of talking to people from all over the world, from all walks of life, in all different places, who are all sharing one common bond. And that's the sadness and the suffering and the sorrow over what we're doing to the environment, whether it's through the climate crisis or environmental extraction and resource development, and all of the things that are happening to the more than human world around us. So, this show is going to unite people together from all over the world, again, from all walks of life, to have the deep and personal and vulnerable conversations about what unites us in this ecological grief, how we live with it, and what we do as we move forward. So, how I got started in this area, really, my first experiences with grief started when I was very young, and they were all related to losses around non humans. And when I was little, my first biggest experience with grief was when I was 5. And I had a very beloved pond near my house, and there was a whole family of beavers. And I loved them, and I used to go all the time and talk to them and look at them and watch them. And they were something that was really important to my world and to my understanding of connections, whether with humans or animals. And I remember, one time I must have been away. I don't know if I was visiting my grandma or if I was on a family trip. And I came back and the beaver dam and the pond had been filled in. And they were starting a development there for a new school. And that loss for me was so profound and so devastating because I couldn't understand as a small child and as a small, human in the world why we would do that to another living creature, why we would take their house, their habitat, and why the beavers were no longer with us. And I remember being so devastated and so bereft and so sad, but not having any words for it and not being able to talk to people about it. So not being able to talk to my friends or my family. And even though I had a wonderfully loving family and very supportive parents, I think that when you're adults, there's not always the language of how you talk to children about grief, whether it's for humans and especially when it's for animals or other creatures. And so I remember my earliest experiences with grief were through this loss, but also what I learned was that if you are experiencing grief, it can be very solitary. And if it's grief that is not for people, that you should hold it in. And I think that really early experience carried with me. And so for so much of my life, I had been experiencing all different forms of ecological grief and loss. So whether it was, clear cutting of beloved forests or, watching habitats change over time that I cared deeply about, or watching, animals that I had a connection with suddenly get shot by hunters, all different things that were happening in my life. And I had always kept it inside. I think sometimes I felt ashamed about it. I felt embarrassed. I thought that I was overly sensitive. And I never had a language that really explained to me what I was experiencing and feeling. And that all changed when I first started doing research. So back in 2008, I started working in Northern Labrador, where I'm currently living. And there was this really key moment that changed everything for me, where I really started to understand that people are experiencing ecological grief, that there are terms for it, that we can connect over it, we can understand it, and we can and should talk about it. So back in 2009, I was working in a community called Brigalet, Nunatsiavut, and it's the southernmost community in a land claim settlement region on the north coast of Labrador. So that's on the far north and the far east of Canada. And I was working with Inuit elders there on a project that linked Inuit and non-Inuit together to talk about climate change and health and the ways in which people were seeing changes from the environment, but then also what it was doing to their health and well-being. And one of the people that I was working with most closely was an elder named Sarah Baikie. And Sarah is just an extraordinary woman and leader and really deeply connected, born and raised on the land, so much knowledge. And so we were sitting in our living room in March in 2009, just looking out at the beautiful harbor. And we were talking about all the changes she was seeing. So all the changes to sea ice, all the changes to the wind patterns and the water patterns, and how plants and animals were changing and storm patterns were changing, and how that was impacting all of their ways of life in this region. And so I said to Sarah, how there's so much change. How does that make you feel? And she paused for a really long time. And then she looked out the window and she started to cry. And she said, "No one has ever asked me that before." And that's where everything changed for me. And that's where my whole research career changed, but also my personal abilities to start to understand and feel grief that I was feeling from the environment. And so Sarah and I sat there that March afternoon, sharing and crying and talking about the grief that is there, the connections that we have, the love for the land, and how much we keep inside and how much we hold inside for fear of telling others, but also sometimes for fear of not being able to deal with the pain and the loss and the sorrow that we're seeing as we watch beloved homes or beloved landscapes or beloved creatures change before our eyes. And then what that means, not only for ourselves, but what does it mean for, grandparents, parents, kids, future generations? And what does it mean for cultures and places and beautiful regions all over the world? So after that conversation with Sarah, everything changed. Everything changed for my research. Everything changed for the whole project that we were doing. And it really launched this multi-year community conversation over all the ways in which people were experiencing very diverse emotions from a climate change impact on the community. So people were talking about feeling sad, anxious, afraid, fearful, depressed, angry, helpless, hopeless. And over a couple of years, our team spoke to over 80 people from all different walks of life, all different genders, all different ages. And everyone that we talked to had so many ways in which what was happening to the environment and what was happening to the climate were impacting their health and well being. So that became the whole focus of what we were doing and looking at climate change and mental health, and particularly the grief and loss that we feel. And so Inuit in this region really became leaders across Canada and even around the globe in telling their stories about the loss and the grief and the experiences that they were feeling. And most importantly, the grief that comes because of how much they love the land and how connected people are to the land and how much awe and joy and beauty. And that was such a profound experience for me, because this idea that that with great grief also can come great joy and great awe, and that the more we open ourselves up to grief, the more we face it, the more we talk about it, the greater our capacity is to feel joy, to feel love. And so even though grief, as people were describing it, is incredibly tough and deserves attention and deserves support, there's also this other part of it that actually carves us out, that creates this space in us where we can face the hard things, where we can open ourselves up to others, where we have this common bond and a common language that connects us. So in 2014, I worked with Inuit all throughout the region of Nunatsiavut from all 5 communities, so Nain, Hopedale, Postville, Makkovik, and Riglet, to create a homemade testimony of love for the land. And it's a film called Lament for the Land, and it's freely available online on YouTube. And it's a love story of people here about the land. And it's also an explanation of all the changes that are happening and how it impacts mental and emotional health and well-being. And this was something we did, so people could tell their stories and people could share among the communities, but also share with people all over the world. And we didn't expect that anything was going to come from it. And we put it up online. And all of a sudden, we were inundated with people from all over the world saying, "I feel this too. This film moved me so much. I've never heard other people talk about it." And particularly other Indigenous people from around the world started reaching out to the people in the film to say, thank you, I feel this too. I haven't seen this represented. These voices and stories are so important. Can we share ours with you? And it created this really amazing dialogue with people. And we met so many people around the world who wanted to say, I live in a totally different environment and climate, but what you're describing and what you're feeling is what I'm feeling. And I didn't know there were words, or there was a way to describe it. I thought I had to keep it quiet. And so this really became the journey of having these global discussions and having discussions with individuals, with communities, with governments, with organizations, with people in other parts of the world, to find out what are the terms, what is it that we need. So one of the terms that I use, and myself and a co-author, Neville Ellis from Australia, we put together a paper on it, is the term ecological grief. And so what we say is that it's the idea of grieving for the environment is not new. People for thousands and thousands of years have been deeply connected and grieved for the more than human. And in fact, it's only modern times where we've separated ourselves out, particularly in a Western culture. So the grief and the connection is not new, but what is new is the need to have terminology and the need to be able to talk about what's happening in a way that brings us together and that unites us. So the concept of ecological grief is really the grief that we feel for the more than human world. So anything that's not human. So that can be ecosystems, that can be bodies of water, it can be forests, it can be individual animals, it can be species, anything that we feel the pain or the loss or suffering of that is not human. And the amazing part about ecological grief is we can experience it in so many different ways. So obviously directly, if we lose something that we care about, or we lose a beloved animal or a species, or we see what's happening with the climate crisis and we know what's coming, or we experience at the front lines of horrible natural disasters and climate-driven disasters such as wildfires and flooding and hurricanes. So there's that frontline grief that we feel. And then there's also this grief that we call anticipatory grief. So the idea that we are anticipating what's to come. We know what's happening. We see what's happening in other places. We know the climate science. It's very clear. And so this idea that we are anticipating what's coming and we are already grieving what is still there but is likely to be gone. And then there's this vicarious grief where we, as very empathetic, connected species of humans, we see the suffering of others. So we can witness things happening in other places. We can see others suffering ecological grief. We can watch people from afar that we may not even have a connection to have this experience. And so ecological grief is another form of grief, which is already very complex and adds all of these different layers. And part of this show is really going to be delving into what is ecological grief? What does it mean? How do we live with it? What are other people doing? How do we understand the nuances? What are the learnings that we can have from just understanding human grief, which at the best of times we're not very grief literate? What can we learn from counselors and therapists? What can we learn from academics? What can we learn from people who are on the front lines? And so each of the shows as we move forward is going to be delving into the personal and the vulnerable conversations with people who are experiencing all different forms of ecological grief, and also can provide insights and new learnings and new understandings, and can create that shared conversation and that shared bond that really ecological grief can bring us together with and through as it becomes our constant companion moving forward. One of the things that I'll be sharing throughout this series and throughout the show is things that really inspire me. And so, whether it's books or whether it's films, things that have helped me. And one of the things that has been really, really important to me is this wonderful book by Frances Weller called The Wild Edge of Sorrow. I highly recommend it. It is a wonderful book on grief and on grieving and about the journeys of grief and the powers of grief. But importantly, Frances Weller incorporates just beautiful sections on why we need to have personal and planetary grief, and how if we cannot open ourselves up to grief in general, we'll never be able to grieve the world, and we need to do that right now. And he has this really beautiful explanation of what ecological grief is that I want to share on this show. He writes, sorrow helps us remember something long intuited by Indigenous peoples across the planet. Our lives are inextricably commingled with one another, with animals, with plants, watersheds, and soil. Our personal experiences of loss and suffering are now bound inextricably with dying coral reefs, melting polar ice caps, the silencing of languages, the collapse of democracy, and the fading of civilization. The personal and the planetary are inseparable, as is our healing. Loss binds us together in a potent alchemy, confirming the heart's intimacy with all things. Losing someone or something we love brings us into the shelter of our mutual grief. Grief and love are sisters, woven together from the very beginning. Their kinship reminds us that there is no love that does not contain loss, and no loss that is not a reminder of the love we carry for once we held so close. And I just love that so much when I think about ecological grief, because what it is showing is the essential interconnection between grief and love. And this, the way he describes it, the constant companion, the sisters being intertwined, that we need both love and grief. And that one of the most beautiful things that we can get from grief is this idea that it is actually a gift. And whenever I say this to people or whenever I have these conversations, you can see that people don't believe it at first. You know, it's like, but grief is so painful. It's so awful. We want to avoid it. We're very grief phobic. It's like, but no, that hurts. And I can't even begin to imagine what it would feel like to open up to grief. I wouldn't know how. But when you think about it, the grief is demonstrating to us that on the other side of it is something that we had that we loved, is something that is so important that we cared about, that we were so connected to. And so whether that's people or whether it's the more than humans, it actually highlights to us this intimate connection that we have between ourselves and the planet. And a connection that for thousands of years, people just intuited, as he says in his quote. It was just there, it was just understood. And it's only in more recent modern Western times that we have been separated away from nature and away from that connection. And that loss has caused such profound disruption and such profound change to our relationships. So the gift of grief is not only about love and showing our connections, it's also about creating a commonality. And Judith Butler has written just the most amazing book called Precarious Life. And it's all about mourning and bodies that matter and bodies that don't, and why some lives are grievable and some lives are not. And what she talks about in this book is that more than any other emotion that we have, grief is the we creating capacity. So it actually creates a we from all of us, that it takes us from being separate individuals and it puts us together, because there is no one alive who will not grieve. There was no one who will not experience loss. And in fact, very few of us, probably even listening to this show, can say that they have not grieved or they have not lost. You know, we are all born into the world and we will lose and other people will lose us. So there's this incredible we creating capacity. There's incredible commonality. It blurs lines between us. It breaks down barriers. And I think in many ways, what it does is strip away things that don't matter, that we can actually come together in grief. We can use grief to be a political and ethical motivator that connects us together. So instead of it being something that we hide from or we feel isolated, if we open ourselves up, if we have these conversations, if we talk about our ecological grief and loss, if we talk about the climate crisis, if we talk about what we are afraid of, what is already lost, what is already coming, and what's coming in the future, it has the ability to bring us together, and it can be an incredible motivator, and it can be something that can make change. And I think, over my lifetime, and in the work that I do, grief is actually the emotion that motivates from a place of love. Now, grief has all of these other things that get mixed in, anger and fear and sadness and depression and anxiety. And we're going to be talking about that in this show. We're going to be peeling away all the different layers. But at the end, if we can get to that place of grief, which is not easy, and it's a lifelong journey in many cases, then I think that's where change is possible. And I think that's where we can really start our own healing, but also the planetary healing that is so required in these times. Part of my motivation for this show is really to bring together people that I've had the honor and privilege of working with for so many years, and people that I have learned from, that have really inspired me, that have touched me, and that have taught me a lot about not only ecological grief, but also about myself. And people that have shown me that the strategies that so many of us have, including myself, of smothering our grief, of hiding from it, of packing it away, of closing the door on it, is not the best strategy and is not a healthy approach. And one of the things that I really struggled with a number of years ago was being immersed in the research that I was doing, and there was so much pain, so much rawness, so much vulnerability, and also so much joy and brilliance that was happening. And I was surrounded by it, and I was immersed in it, and it really triggered my own um, past grief that I didn't know I hadn't dealt with, both for ecological grief and for human grief. And as I was going through this research, I didn't expect to face to really experience this incredible form of breathness where I was just taken out and I didn't see it coming. And perhaps if I had paid attention more, I would have seen it coming over my life, and things that I had hidden away and things that I hadn't processed and dealt with. But it was like having these conversations and talking to people and experiencing and witnessing other people's pain and suffering and strength and resilience and vulnerability and love triggered so much in me. And there was this period of time during this research where I just felt completely incapacitated and burnt out. And I didn't know what to do, and I didn't know how to move forward. And I actually developed a really interesting neurological condition in my forearms and my shoulders, where it actually made me unable to type, which, as an academic and someone who was working on her PhD and her dissertation, that was, what I needed to do. I needed to be able to type. And nothing was working. I saw specialists. I tried everything, and, massage and physio and acupuncture, and I saw neurologists, and no one had any ideas about what to do. And then I ended up talking to one of the elders that I was working with. And the question that that person asked me was, have you taken the time to grieve? Like, have you let stuff out of your body? And at that point, I didn't want to. I was afraid of opening the floodgates, but I also was afraid that didn't, if I started to grieve, that I would somehow take the space of others who were suffering more. And I didn't want my grief to overshadow other people's grief. And so I had been keeping it and smothering it and pushing it down. And, the amazing wisdom that I received that day about, have I made space for grieving? And that if I can't grieve my own loss and my own pain and my own suffering, how will I ever expect to understand and support others? And so that gave me the permission, I think, that I had never really thought I had before, to take time and to truly just grieve. And it was an incredibly intense period of time, where it really challenged all of my conceptualizations of who I was and what I had experienced and what I was going through, and all of the things that were coming up. And once I did that, and once I let it go, all of the neurological challenges that I had had and all of the chronic pain all went away. And it was like the body needed to let go, and to have that release and that acknowledgement that we carry within ourselves bodily and somatic memories of grief and pain, and unprocessed things. So when things happen to us and we don't have a chance to process, particularly when we're children, it does come back, and it come back in various ways, and it can affect us. So for me, being immersed in the research was suddenly what made me confront my own unprocessed loss and grief. And that lesson for me was so important, but I struggle with it every day, because I also know that part of the reason why I study this, why I research it, why I talk about it, is because it's easier to write and talk and research about grief than it is to actually sit in it and actually feel and actually let it out. So while I love the work that I do, sometimes I worry that it is a bit of an unhealthy coping strategy, that it actually helps me talk about grief without feeling grief. I can think it, but I don't have to feel it. And so part of this journey is I'm hoping that the amazing people that we're going to be meeting along the way and through all the different episodes are going to help us all get to that deeper place, and to not be afraid to get to that deeper place, and to really allow grief to be our constant companion now. Because I really feel, and certainly from the research that I do and the people that I talk to, that ecological grief is not going anywhere, that the mental health impacts of climate change are going to be very profound, very widespread, very cumulative, and something that we're all going to be grappling with and dealing with in various ways. So, the more that we can build our grief resilience, our grief skills, our grief understanding, our grief strength, and the more that we're able to feel we are supported and held and heard in our grief about the losses that we're experiencing from the climate crisis and environmental change, the more we're going to be able to move forward and to feel our most authentic selves, even in times of great challenge, great fear, and of great crises. And so I love this idea that we can have these conversations together and we can be brokenhearted, because I am just totally brokenhearted about what is coming. When I think about people that are friends that are already experiencing tremendous loss, when I think about the loss of species, the extinction, the loss of landscapes, the incredible disruption and terror and horror of wildfires and flooding and storms and hurricanes and everything that is to come. When I think about my kids and what sort of future that they're going to have, I'm so brokenhearted, but I don't want to close up. And I've learned enough from the amazing people that I've gotten to work with that closing up is about the worst thing that we can do. And so I want to be both brokenhearted and open-hearted. And I'm hoping that these conversations will help you too feel to be able to hold space to be brokenhearted and open-hearted, and that we can move forward together. So, what are we going to do together on this journey and with this show? We're going to talk to people from all over the world. We're going to hear their stories. We're going to have conversations, and we're going to engage in the hard parts, the messy parts, the sneaky parts, the scary parts, the painful parts, and also the joyous parts, the things that bring us hope and renewal and healing and abundance, and all of the things that help us move forward, even in very challenging and very tough times. So, in many ways, this show is about grief, and it's about ecological grief and loss, but it also is a form of grieving. It just looks differently than we might think grieving is. But this is my way of sharing grief and being vulnerable, and also finding ways to continue to open space in myself, to challenge myself to go deeper, and to plumb the depths of grief and loss and fear and anxiety that I have, that I know that I'm not properly dealing with, and that I know I need to. And so I'm hoping these discussions will bring us all together to these points where we can share our vulnerabilities, we can share our humanity, we can share our grief, and most importantly, we can share our love, and we can all become grief advocates and ecological grief advocates. So, as we're coming near to the end of this first episode, I want to end with another Francis Weller quote. And again, I highly recommend reading The Wild Edge of Sorrow. It is just a truly beautiful book. He writes at the very, very end of his book, "So much in this world needs our attention. So much is threatened and clinging perilously to the edge of existence. We know this is true. Grief is our witness to these painful realities, and grief is also our response that confirms our intimate bond with all creation. When we leave here, it is essential that we feel that we did all we could for the generations to come, for this sweet earth, and for all we loved. When we leave here, let us pray that life will continue after we are gone. Let us hope that the whales will continue the migrations they have made for millions of years, that snow geese will still follow their instincts from the Arctic to their winter grounds and back again, that monarch butterflies will swarm and fill the sky with their beauty. And wherever we are in this world or have entered the vast realm of the ancestors, there will still be much for us to care for. As Rumi said, this night will pass, and then we have work to do. So we have work to do together through this journey and also as individuals and collectives. We have work to do to face our ecological grief, to learn about it, to share about it, and then to move forward to make a change in this world that is so desperately needed. And so join me on this journey of loss and love as we share a common bond of ecological grief. And remember, and following Francis Weller, it takes outrageous courage to face outrageous loss. So courage, my friends, and until next time, take good care. This was Second Nature, Living with Ecological Grief. Thank you for joining us today for another powerful conversation about environmental love and loss. And of course, the conversation continues. So please make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and visit ashleeconsolo.ca for more information. Until next time, thanks for tuning in, and take good care.